Very good morning, everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss oracy and its scope. By oracy, I mean the ability to do oral communication or our ability to listen and speak. So in this presentation, I will talk about the concept of oracy itself, the influences on oracy, and the scope of research in this field. Now, the resources that I'm using are these two, the Saussure, chapter 3. I think this is a very important book in linguistics. It's called Course in General Linguistics. And I think chapter 3 lends itself to the discussion of oral communication and oracy. I would also like to take a rather historical perspective and discuss some of the historical influences on oracy, which has been highlighted by Wilkinson 1965's paper, as you see on top. There are also 3 videos that I have already created and uploaded to this YouTube channel, which I would like you to watch if you're interested to extend your idea about oracy and how language works. Now, I should also add that in this presentation, I use the term language mostly as synonymously with the term oracy, because what I mean by language is really oral communication, and I'm not referring to written communication. In addition, if you are interested, I would highly recommend these 2 books, one by Everett and Noam Chomsky, published in 2015, the one right in the right-hand side, which is entitled Why Only Us, and the other one by Daniel Everett, which is called Language, the Cultural Tool. I would also talk about the gist of these 2 books, a very, very brief introduction to the 2 works, and I will elaborate how these 2 actually represent different schools of thoughts when it comes to language and oracy ability. So let's get started with oracy. Oracy was defined by Wilkinson as an individual's general ability to use the skills of speaking and listening. And it has been known to be a tool which people use in order to engage with speech with important aspects of the social and physical world. For example, when you ask someone to do something for you, you're not directly influencing the physical world around you, but you would require that person to change some part of the physical environment in which you are living. For example, when you ask someone to open the door, the words themselves cannot open the door, but the influence that you exert on that person will result in opening the door, of course, provided that person is polite enough to open the door for you. What Wilkinson also stresses is that language or oracy and humans have dual influences on each other. He argues that if you change the language of some person through some, for example, intervention, you would be able to change the personality of that person. On the other hand, if you change the personality of that person, you would be able to change the speech of that person as well. And I think this is true because, for example, if someone has never gone to school and has never gone through the formal stream of education, provided that the person has never read anything on their own, after a few years of schooling and education, you'll probably be able to see some differences in the way that they speak, in the way that they use language, in the way that they think as well. So this seems to be some evidence to show that language and personality actually have a very kind of complicated and interwoven network of connections. Now, Wilkinson discusses a few influences on oracy. Some of them still make sense, some of them do not apply anymore in perhaps modern society. I'm going to go through this one by one. One of them is the influence of early environments on our oracy ability, education and its influence on oracy, the social environments, the broadcasting, and I think broadcasting is not probably as strong as it used to be, and perhaps some national stereotypes, which I would talk about in details. Now, I would like to also mention that what I'm presenting here is a part of the first lecture of a course called Oracy Development and Research. So some of these concepts will be unraveled in the same course in other sessions, like the first one, that's early environment, which will be discussed further during week 6, just like the third concept, social environments, which also will be discussed in week 6. That's why you see those phrases. Now, let's get started with the first influence on oracy. That's basically our early environment. When we are born, normal kids, actually the term normal is used by Wilkinson in his paper, but today we were using the term neurotypical versus neurodivergent kids or neurodivergent people. So if we are neurotypical, we experience language in our environment which affects the cognitive and orectic development of us. One of the interesting concepts that Wilkinson alludes to is the differences between expression of thoughts and communication. He actually adopts Piaget's idea about language being a tool for expressing our thoughts. So language is just for expressing thoughts versus the idea that language is to communicate. These are two actually different ideas. Piaget also mentions both of them, and he also refers to the fact that language has two dimensions, egocentric and social dimensions. Egocentric speech most dominantly or prominently is observed in children. For example, the moment that they're born, they start to express themselves without even having any slightest clue that language could be used for communication. They start to express themselves through crying. And if you assume that crying is a part of the language development of kids, so we can say that language is also used. Language is used from the very moment of birth for expressing thoughts, for expressing yourselves. Whatever the thought is crossing the mind of a newly born infant, it's being expressed through those cries. That's why we have the concept egocentric. Another example of egocentric speech is when kids are playing with themselves, when nobody else is around, like they're playing with a bunch of toys, and they speak, they express their thoughts. Arguably, that can be taken as evidence that the kid is engaged in some kind of egocentric speech, which is just to express thoughts that are being produced in their mind or in their brain, if you will. On the other hand, another function of speech is communication, and that's the social concept of speech. It's used for communicating with other people. Now, as I will explain further later, people like Chomsky do not really believe that language evolved or emerged to satisfy our communicative needs, because we do have another language, according to Berling, which is used for communication, and that's a language which is also used with other similar species. For example, nonverbal communication, vocalizations, gestures, body language, and those kind of things, which some people like Berling differentiate from the articulated or spoken language. Therefore, Wilkinson, following Piaget, believes that language is used for expressions of thoughts and also for communication. However, later in the same paper, what he stresses more is the social dimensions of speech. On the other hand, someone like Chomsky and Saussure basically discuss the expression of thoughts through language. So I think the choice of Wilkinson and Saussure and also other works that I showed previously is kind of good combination. Now let's move on to influences on oracy when it comes to education. Education can also affect our oracy quite significantly. But Wilkinson is lamenting about the over-reliance of the teaching of literacy at schools versus oracy. During his time, formal schooling, as he puts it, showed literacy and oracy at enmity. In some educational systems, we might still be looking at the same phenomenon. That's oracy is secondary or even tertiary to literacy, and literacy is almost everything. Back then in 1965 it was so, and it might still be the same in some educational systems. Wilkinson went on to say that education has been predominantly a matter of reading and writing, and however, if literacy is important, oracy is more so. He referred to three notions or concepts. One is an institution called grammar schools in the UK, which stressed concept 2 and 3. That's the theory of grammar and the theory of literature. Especially older grammar schools stress that the more you practice grammar and some grammatical rules, and the more you are engaged in reading literature or perhaps producing literature, the more intelligent or smarter you would become, which again, according to Wilkinson, is not true. He provides evidence from early research around his time that this cannot be true. And I think today that's also, we know that it's not scientifically true as well. Now this slide is a bit verbose and kind of crowded, so I'm going to take some time to walk you through this, because we have got two pictures on top and quite a few bullet points here. The slide is actually presenting social environments as another influence on oracy. In other words, where we live, in what social environments we live, can affect our oracy abilities. Wilkinson observes that there is a correlation between social class, that's what we refer to as socioeconomic status today, and educational attainments. But then he raises the question as to whether there is any reason for this, why there is a relationship between socioeconomic status and educational attainment, and as a result, the oracy ability of people. So he presents some postulations. One of them is that especially in some families where the children are put to a boarding school, children speak more with their peers than their parents. Right at the bottom of this slide here, in this blue box, you see Wilkinson says, in an independent boarding school known to the writer, the boys are away from home most of the years and have very little converse with adults outside the authoritarian school relationships. Again, their main oral practice is with their peers. They're not very orate. What he's trying to say is that if your main practice is with a group of people whose oracy ability is more or less at the same level of you, then you will not have a great chance to improve on your oracy ability or your speaking abilities. In a sense, this is true, but it's not exactly 100% correct, because some neuroscience research shows that engaging in a conversation with kids, what I mean exactly is the conversation or dialogue, and I would like to stress dialogue, not a one-way kind of communication, but dialogue between the caregiver and the kid can result in the development of certain parts of the brain, especially the frontal cortex, which is associated with higher thinking and critical thinking. And so from this perspective, it's correct. I mean, I will elaborate on this in another video for sure, because I think this is really a very interesting research idea. But it's true that if children are not exposed to a more sophisticated sort of language than what they know, the development of their language will not be as much as if they were exposed to more kind of sophisticated language. That's one thing. The other idea that Wilkinson proposes is that oracy depends on a few subjects, and he actually proposes these ideas, these four influences, just based on his own reasoning and justification. We know that they are actually influential on oracy abilities of students nowadays, but they're not limited to these four. One of them is the subject knowledge. If you have some world knowledge about what you want to talk about, of course it affects your oracy fluency or the accuracy of language that you use. And the second one is the prestige of speaker and listener. This is quite interesting because it reminds me of the idea of genre, together with the last one, which is knowledge of conventions. Together, these two, I translate them into the knowledge of genre and the knowledge of the other person, the speaker, the audience, in other words, because that would allow you to retrieve the sort of information that's relevant to that situation from your long-term memory. And it's also, well, a kind of idea that has been supported by recent research. The last one is, the last influence on oracy is the attitudes of the people towards each other. Now, the concept of attitude can be unraveled further. There's a tripartite model for attitude, which assumes that attitude has three dimensions. It starts from cognition, that's our knowledge of the person or the object about which we have an attitude. Then affect, that's our feelings plus emotions, and these are two different concepts. Plus the last dimension, which is behavior. That's dimension 3. Now, we can actually measure emotions and feelings through modern technologies. And in this course, we will talk about two of these modern technologies. One of them is the facial recognition technology, where you can measure 6 basic emotions, such as anger, fright, disgust, and so on and so forth, plus another technology which is called galvanic skin response, or GSR. In the future, I will talk about these two more, but it's interesting to see that how some ideas, some kind of postulations like those that have been proposed by Wilkinson can be tested by modern technology. Actually, one of my students used the one on the left-hand side, that facial recognition technology. She used a software package called Face Reader, and we found that it does the kind of emotions that the stimuli evokes in the listener can affect their speaking significantly. We measured that through some tasks, and I hope in the future I will have time to speak about that more. Now let's move on to the next bullet point, which has to do with another influence on oracy, and what Wilkinson suggests that researchers should do, and I couldn't agree more. He says that we need to investigate all aspects of oracy. That's, for example, the kind of language which is spoken at playgrounds, or even phatic language, where we use the so-called swearing and oathing and those kind of language, F words and S words and those kind of language. Because these are also necessary parts of oracy. What he's trying to imply here is the way that a person speaks, regardless of the so-called social class he's coming from, has to be investigated. We have to take an objective viewpoint, an objective perspective when it comes to research, and investigate all dimensions of research, all dimensions of oracy, including the sort of language which is used in playgrounds, which is absolutely informal, and from the perspective of formal grammar, most of the articulations by kids could be considered as grammatically wrong. But he says that's not how we should define oracy, and he's right, actually. So basically there are significant generic differences between oral language and written language. That's what Wilkinson was trying to say in 1965, and it just makes a lot of sense today. The other influence on oracy is broadcasting. He argues that broadcasting has been which has been mostly done through standard English or received pronunciation, again, we're talking about 1965, is in a sense promoting and propagating the idea of supremacy of these kinds of dialects. But he thinks that these are only one of the many available dialects of English, and he's right. Because I don't even remember the last time that I heard the term received pronunciation. I should say it's really fortunate that these terms are not used anymore, because we know that people have different accents. Basically, no accent is intrinsically any better than another accent. So the idea of world Englishes or even Asian Englishes, perhaps African Englishes, have emerged. And I know that there are specialized journals that focus on research and education related to world Englishes and Asian Englishes. An interesting phenomenon is that even though we perceive someone's pronunciation to be, for example, of a received pronunciation nature or standard English nature, or even though we think or we assume that someone is speaking the Queen's English, recent research shows that actually people oscillate. The oscillation is significant and can be measured. For example, this paper in Nature, published in Nature, shows that even the Queen of England does not always speak the Queen's English. And this is quite funny because it obviously shows that what we assume about the so-called received pronunciation, standard English, and those kind of highly prestigious accents does not always hold. People deviate from them if you take a scientific perspective towards them. I'm not exactly sure if this idea of, for example, received pronunciation still holds today. Like I said, because there are many different dialects which are recognized and very well tolerated. And a lot of people, including myself, love different accents. I like it when I hear a very, a kind of accent which is quite different from what I have heard and exposed to before, because that indicates that a very unique phenomenon is going on in the brain of the speaker. And as a researcher, I would immediately become interested to investigate how that works and how the brain of that person works to produce that kind of accent, and how different that accent is from other accents which are out there. Finally, national stereotypes. Apparently, there have been quite a lot of national stereotypes during the time of Wilkinson, and it's nice to know about them in 2020. I'm not trying to talk about all the history of these stereotypes, but some of the points that are important, and I would like to stress here, is that there were some national images that were common and perhaps quite universal in the society where Wilkinson was living. One of them was that according to the sort of accent of the sort of English that people spoke, some of them were assigned to the first class people. So there was sort of first class English, then second class, then third class, primarily based on their looks and their accents. Well, it rings a bell because based on the looks of people and accents, in many societies we still have those kind of things. We have a kind of covert assignment of people to the second class in certain societies. We see that the police, unfortunately, mistreat some people with certain backgrounds to the extent that they allow themselves to sit on their back and press their necks so much so to gradually and painfully take their lives. A part of this problem, in my opinion, has to do with the way that people look. Not their looks, actually, the way that other people perceive them to be, and the way that they sound. Meaning that how another person sounds and looks can affect the emotions and feelings of other people around him, and atrocities can easily be committed based on that. It has actually a very long history in the history of humanity. As researchers, what we need to do is to raise people's awareness that these superficial differences are nothing, actually. For example, the concept of race, which is still dominant in many societies. And even when you're filling a governmental form, you have to fill in what your race is. It's still common, but the concept of race, the notion of race is spurious. It's not scientific. It was probably developed in somewhere maybe in 18th or 19th century. I don't know really about the history, but it was being commonly used in 19th century by a group of people who referred to themselves as white, and then white versus the others. But today, biology and genetics have shown us that race doesn't have, and anthropology as well, that race doesn't have any scientific justification. The closest concept here to something like race is reference populations, but I think that's kind of quite tricky because it needs the genetic analysis of people. Anyway, I hope that one day we will not have these concepts anymore, these notions like race, and they will stop to affect people's perceptions and feelings for each other, like hatreds. If the feelings are good, that's fine. I mean, that would be nice. But I think most often they have resulted in belligerent attitudes, animosity, and hatred, especially when you look at the history of the world. So Wilkinson goes on to say that very little is known about the nonverbal aspects of communication. They may lie in the room itself, in the dress or stance of the speaker, as well as the facial and bodily movements he makes. This makes a lot of sense. The kind of body language we use, the facial expressions we put on, could easily, in the mind of the listener, could easily differentiate us from a certain group of people. That could easily mean, to a listener, it could easily mean that I, as a speaker, belong to, for example, second class, or I'm a non-educated person, or etc. It would be important to investigate what these factors are, and I think in applied linguistics we do need to investigate these factors more. Now, today, oracy is a more research concept, I should say. Some of the theoretical frameworks that are connected with oracy include interactional competence or interactive competence, communicative competence, and its subcomponents, nonverbal communication, plus some of the predictors of oracy that in some research in psychology and sociology have been shown to impact different dimensions of oracy or oral communication, such as people's personality, such as environmental factors, or even genetics of people, plus what we call intersubjectivity, which is close to the theory of mind, which in some research fields has been investigated through modern technologies like neuroimaging. A technique is called hyperscanning. I'm going through these not in this presentation, but in later videos and presentations, because they really need quite a long time to discuss and unravel. Now, I would like to unpack 4 takes on the scope of oracy. I would like to go through them quickly at the interest of time. One of them was proposed by Ferdinand Saussure, the other one by Noam Chomsky, then Delheim's response to Noam Chomsky, then another response to Noam Chomsky by Daniel Everett. So let's get started with Ferdinand de Saussure. Actually, in other videos I have talked about his ideas at some length. I will provide the links to those videos, and if you have not watched them, please take some moments to watch them. I think they will be interesting because they have been animated as much as we could do that. and so they provide more details there. Saussure thinks that language is for thinking, so it's a thought tool. It's pretty much like what Chomsky believes in, and it partly is in agreement with what Wilkinson and Piaget also agree with. So Saussure thinks or argues that this oral communication or oral oracy, or he doesn't use the term oracy, but in my opinion what he's referring to is oracy, has got two dimensions. One dimension is speech or parole, and the other one is language or lang. So language is stored in the brain of people in a collectivity, whereas speech is individual specific and is articulated via signs, and these signs include sounds and gestures, as well as written communication as well, like written words. Now, according to Saussure, speech has a history and an evolution, which means that it evolves from childhood to adulthood. So what he's proposing here is we don't just want to put all our eggs into the basket of the sort of language that is produced by adults. If you want to investigate speech, you need to investigate the speech that is produced by children and adults, not just one group. On the other hand, language is humans' natural faculty, which according to Saussure has a biological storage. And he thinks that storage, and when we were talking about 1916, where actually before 1916, where this idea was proposed, he thinks that this ability or faculty is stored in what is known as Broca's area. It's an area in the left hemisphere and in some people's left hemisphere of the brain, and some people the right hemisphere of the brain, depending on whether you're right-handed or left-handed. It's a smaller part of what we call IFG, or inferior frontal gyrus, and that's here. You can see it in this picture here, right? The red part, the red spot. So he thinks that language has a physiological dimension to it. When I think about it, I see an uncanny resemblance with what Noam Chomsky proposed later, but he referred to this dichotomy as competence and performance. They're extremely similar to me, and I do know that Chomsky, of course, stressed the idea of genetics and DNA and the fact that humans have been wired to produce language. Of course, during Saussure's time, I don't think that genetic science had advanced that much. I'm not sure if the ideas of DNA and similar concepts were known to humanity back then. But I think they have a lot of overlaps. Now, the last point that I would like to highlight here is that Saussure believed that speech may or may not be natural, whereas language is. By natural, we mean that a part of the brain evolved, at least the part that we know as Broca's area, evolved to store and produce language. Whereas speech may not be natural in the sense that, as he says, there's no evidence that vocal organs in the vocal cavity actually evolved just for producing speech. It was probably out of convenience that humans chose this over other mediums of communication. To my knowledge, we still do not know whether this is true or not, but hopefully in the future, scientists will find evidence as to whether the vocal organs of humans evolved for speech or evolved for something else, but speech is also something that could be done with it, so humans also use it also for producing speech. And this is how I have presented the social dimension of language in the brain of people. Every skull and brain represents one person, so language exists in a collectivity, not in the brain of one person. Together, everything that people know about language is actually called language. And finally, I think these two circuits are important, two representations of the production and perception circuits. And I would like to elaborate on them. Saussure argues that here on the left-hand side, as this photo shows, that the process of the production starts with a psychological aspect. When you generate a concept, then the concept is immediately transformed into what he calls a sound image, which is then so when you generate the sound image, and that marks the end of the psychological process. Then following this, the physiological process starts. The sound image, some brain impulses that represent the sound image are sent to the vocal organs through the nervous cells, and then they are articulated by the mouth. After the articulation, the physical process starts. So the waves are transferred to the ears of the listener, or someone who perceives your codes. And according to Saussure, the reverse process of production starts to take place in the brain of the listener. Of course, today we know that the process is not that reverse. They have differences. Speaking and listening do have the differences at the neurological and psychological levels. Another point that I would like to emphasize here is that actually even the psychological dimension of speech is heavily reliant on physiology. If physiology doesn't take place, that's those chemical reactions in the brain of speakers or listeners, then no psychology will emerge from this. And I assume Saussure uses the term psychology to refer to the cognitive attributes that emerge and that we feel and we perceive from those chemical reactions that take place in the brain. To many biologists, that dimension might not necessarily exist, and it might be just a perception. So that's really something that's still being debated. This circuit also represents the same phenomenon, but in a different way, using different terminologies. So if you are a speaker, you start the process of phonation, and then you send the signals, pretty much like what you saw here, to the listener, and the listener starts audition. That's listening comprehension, or what we call listening comprehension today. Saussure doesn't use the term comprehension. And then you respond to the speaker, and then you become the person who's producing phonation, and the other person becomes the person who does audition. This is like a rapid change of roles between listeners and speakers. Okay, so Saussure believes that speech is many-sided. In today's terminology, we can say it's multidimensional and it's heterogeneous, meaning that from person to person, speech is different. Unlike language. Language is not different, and people cannot change the language because it's stored in a collectivity, in the brain of all people who speak that language, whatever language it is. And finally, he proposes that we should study the language via what he calls semiology, a science of signs that studies the life of signs within society. And then the rest of his book is primarily about semiology, phonology, and those concepts. Now I want to move on to Chomsky's ideas and Everett's ideas about language, but I think I need to preface that by speaking a little bit about evolution of humans, or the genus of Homo. So I would like to start the preface by saying that, of course, this course and this presentation is not about paleoanthropology or biology or anthropology or anything like that. But I think these fields that we have created are not the way that nature works. In other words, if we are a linguist or a teacher, it doesn't mean that we should just totally ignore the findings of biology or anthropology about the emergence and the evolution of humans. I think we should know something about them, at least. Some basic ideas really are necessary. And beyond that, I think it's important to start rigorous interdisciplinary research, where we start to look at different dimensions of human language rather than just one dimension, which is investigated under linguistics and applied linguistics paradigms. I think we need to take into account the evolution of language, the differences between us, species of Homo sapiens, and other species, and see what we can get from that. Now, with that said, I'd like to here just quickly show you what this diagram is about, and then link it back to language itself. As you see, these are different species. I have drawn this line. It's actually from Encyclopedia Britannica. I've drawn this line to separate the genus of Homo. As you can see, the word Homo appears in all these words, Homo, 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 all the way, from non-Homos or Australopithecus. Australopithecus, Australa means southern, and I think Pithecus means man or species, something like that. So something that was found in southern Africa. So we have different species before the emergence of Homos, meaning that there is no evidence that Homos lived around the same time as these species were living, or there is, based on my understanding, there's no evidence yet. There are two factors here. As we move from Australopithecus gary and Australopithecus africanus, the size of the brain increases gradually from 300 cc to 700 cc, and that's the end of Australopithecus. On top, we also have gorillas and our closest cousins today, chimpanzees, and perhaps bonobos also, because bonobos are also kind of chimpanzee, whose brain size is pretty small and falls within the region where Australopithecus boisei and also Australopithecus gary falls. Now, what happens here is a gradual change in the size of the brain when other new species start to evolve and emerge, like Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, or is also Homo habilis. It's also known as handyman because it's argued that Homo habilis was probably one of the first species which started to create tools and use them. On the other hand, some anthropologists and of course linguists like Daniel Everett, whom I will talk about in a second, believe that tools were created by Homo erectus, something between 2 million years ago, or 2.5 million years ago to 2 million years ago. So this is Homo erectus. As you see, the size of the brain of Homo erectus or Homo ergaster is pretty close. This is 1,200 cc to the size of the brain of a Homo sapien. That's us. So actually, when we die, we would look like this guy here on top. Interestingly, the only Homo that had a larger brain size than Homo sapiens is Homo neanderthalensis. Now, what we can conclude from this picture here is that the size of the brain, of course proportionate to the size of the body, is one factor that could be associated with the generation of symbolic behavior, one symbolic behavior being language. Because Daniel Everett believes and argues that based on the tools that have been recovered in archaeological digs, Homo erectus was able to do some symbolic thinking. I have discussed this in another video, so I'm not planning to go through the same thing again here. So I would recommend that you watch that video. I will leave the link in the comments section. As a result, Homo neanderthalensis or Neanderthals probably were able to do some symbolic thinking. We don't have strong evidence for this claim though. And finally, for Homo sapiens, there's all evidence that Homo sapiens engaged in symbolic thinking. I'll get back to this. So, in conclusion, the size of the brain relative to the size of the body seems to be one of those factors that can determine whether a species is able to think symbolically or is capable of symbolic behavior or not. If a species is capable of symbolic behavior, then things like language, religion, ideologies, imagination, and all sort of things that humans can do could be done by that species, or that species has the capacity to produce them. Next comes Noam Chomsky and this gentleman here, Noam Chomsky. I talk about that as well. Noam Chomsky believes that oral language is an object of biology. So oracy is an object of biology, not necessarily linguistics, because he thinks that humans are wired to learn language. Language is in our DNA. He assumes that oracy, the way that Homo sapiens actually generated, has two major causes, or two major factors that give rise to oracy. One is the genetic composition, which is obviously different in humans, in all species actually. And one of the reasons that he proposes is the fact that if you, for example, get a chimpanzee's baby like this is called Noam Chomsky, a kind of pun, whose name was just slightly different from Noam Chomsky. So if you get Noam and Noam, baby Noam, and Noam and baby Noam, and raise them in the same human family, at the age of 3 or 4, you'll see that Noam is speaking the fluent language, for example, English or Mandarin or Arabic or any other human languages, but Noam is lagging way behind Noam, because Noam is not wired with the capacity that Noam is wired with. And a lot of investigations were conducted on different chimpanzees, and this hypothesis seems to be supported. No chimpanzee has ever been able to learn syntactic language. They were able to communicate, but as some scholars argued, it was primarily for getting an award. And that was, for example, getting a banana or getting some food or some attention. But they never started a conversation for a different reason. For example, they never started a conversation to transfer some knowledge or some information that they knew to another person just for fun or for other purposes that humans use language for. By the way, the sort of language they used was not vocal. They communicated through body language, which is another reason why Chomsky believes that we have been wired in it, and as a result, our vocal cavity, vocal organs have been subjected to the force of evolution throughout the years, and they have also been reshaped as a result of those forces, and so we can produce vocal language. Okay, so the other factor is a general natural law, something like computational efficiency or efficacy paradigm, which Chomsky and Berwick in the recent book, Why Only Us, argue. But they don't really elaborate on what this computational efficiency is. They do refer to the Turing idea about computational efficacy, but they don't elaborate how that works. They also refer to the genetic differences between Neanderthals and humans. Pabo is a researcher who was actually the first researcher who extracted the DNA of Neanderthals. He realized that there are 3 groups of genes that are different in humans and Neanderthals. And one of these groups, which is the smallest one, probably has the highest impact when it comes to the production of symbolic language or symbolic behavior. Let's call it group 3. There are around 87 or 83, I don't exactly remember the number, but it's either 83 or 87 genes that differentiate us from Neanderthals in this group. So Berwick and Chomsky argue that this might be one area of investigation for future research, to find out what genes exactly are important in the production of language. So it seems that Chomsky means that there is a group of genes that coalesce and collaborate to give rise to the ability of speaking or language. And he thinks it's purely biological in the sense that we have, for example, limbs, we have hands that grow over time, we have the brain that grows, everything else, the internal organs grow and change over time. And in the same way, language grows. The time from the time when we are born to the rest of our life, language keeps changing and growing. And by the third year in our lifetime, we're able to speak fluently and produce a large number of sentences and understand and produce words in a completely different way than other species would be able to do. So the nature of language remains to be a mystery according to this theoretical framework, because we still do not know what genetic composition differentiates us from other creatures, or other species, I should say, and what kind of general natural law Chomsky and Berwick are talking about. It will be interesting to find out whether there is any solution to this problem in, let's say, 20 years from now or 30 years from now. But I think researchers will continue to investigate this problem, even though this nut has been proved to be quite hard to crack. I think one day, sooner or later, it will start to crack. As a response to Chomsky, Delheims proposed his communicative competence. Initially, he called it speaking, which is a mnemonic, which stands for setting and scenes, participants, ends, act sequence, key, instrumentalities, norms, and genre. Now, I have discussed this in another video. Please do take a moment to watch that video. It's not long, maybe it's just 3 or 4 minutes. So I'm not going to go through these at the interest of time. Later on, he proposed the idea of communicative competence, which is going to be the main topic for another video that I will produce soon in the future. Another response was by Daniel Everett. Daniel said, language started like 500,000 years after the emergence of Homo erectus. In other words, Homo erectus emerged around 2,500,000 years ago. But between that time and the emergence of the first tools, there is an interval of 500,000 years. For 500,000 years, Homo erectus was not capable of producing any symbolic behavior for any reasons which we're not aware of. But the tools started to emerge around 2 million years ago. And this has been actually supported by a lot of evidence. In order to create a tool, you need some kind of thinking. You need to have a mental map to shape the tool. At some point, you might want to transfer the knowledge that you have accumulated to someone else, to another member of your species, to your child, so that they will also learn that. Therefore, you need a communication instrument, which will be something like a language. This is the idea that Daniel Everett proposes, and unlike Chomsky, who believes that all languages have a hierarchical structure, and I haven't talked about it, by the way, I just want to touch on this and move on. Hopefully in the future I will talk about it more. But he believes that no, language does not always have a hierarchical structure. His life story is very interesting because he went to an Amazonian tribe as a missionary to kind of invite them to Christianity. So he was there to transfer this message of the Bible to them. But he said a few years later he exited that forest while he was an atheist. He thought that what he was preaching didn't make much sense anymore because he started to think about what he was preaching. That's an interesting phenomenon. So he looked into all dimensions of communication of that tribe and also the language. And also put together some evidence from paleoanthropology, and he discussed them in details in his book, which I presented before. It's called Language. So I'm going to move on to some final thoughts. I think in the future I'll need to make some videos on communicative competence, interactional competence, and also the differences between speaking and listening, because they all have to do with the concept of oracy. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, Berling has argued that there are two communication systems. In other words, humans have two systems for communication, verbal and nonverbal. It's very important that we investigate both, not just one. The nonverbal communication system still needs to be investigated in more detail, including gestures, suprasegmental features, body language, eye contact, and those kind of things. Thank you very much for your attention. This brings me to the end of this long video. I hope that you liked it, and I hope it answered some of your questions. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section. I'll try to address them as much as I can. And thank you very much for your attention, and have a good day.